The rain had turned the coach road to a river of gray mud, and the man who limped into Nettlefold that October evening wore no coat worth the name. His boots had split at the seam. His hands were raw. The village saw him at the edge of the green near the horse trough, and the village decided in the space of a single glance what he was: a vagrant, a beggar working his way from parish to parish before the workhouse claimed him. The blacksmith's wife drew her children indoors. The innkeeper stood in his doorway, with his arms folded, and did not move to open it wider. Only one person crossed the green toward him rather than away. Her name was Margaret Aldous, though the household she served called her simply the kitchen girl, as though she had been issued no other name at birth. She was 22 years of age, with brown hair pinned plainly beneath a linen cap, and a gray work gown gone thin at the elbows. She carried a covered basin under her shawl, bread and dripping meant for the gatehouse porter, and she stopped in front of the stranger because his lips had gone the color of ash, and no one else would. He looked at her the way a man looks who has not been looked at in a long while. What Margaret did not yet know, what the whole of Nettlefold did not know, was that the beggar at the trough was Julian Hartford, Viscount Denholm, master of the very estate whose kitchen she scrubbed. She did not know that he had walked the last 11 miles on a broken boot, because he had wished once in his life to arrive somewhere. As no one, she only knew that a man was cold, and that she had bread. You will hear a great deal in this story about what people are worth and who decides it. Stay a while, it is worth the telling. Margaret uncovered the basin and held it out without ceremony. It is not much, she said, but it is warm, and you are not. He took the bread in both hands. He did not thank her in the manner of a gentleman with a bow and a phrase. He simply ate, and between one mouthful and the next he said, "You did not ask where I have come from. You have come from the road," Margaret answered. "That is plain enough. The rest is your own to keep." Something moved behind his eyes, some small settling, as though a weight he had carried a long way had shifted an inch on his back. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, despite the hunger that had thinned him, with dark hair plastered flat by the rain and a jaw set hard against the cold. There was a pale scar through his left eyebrow that the weather had made livid. His eyes were the gray of slate under water. Margaret marked all of this and made nothing of it, for a face was only a face, and a hungry man was a hungry man. Behind her, from the direction of the great house, a bell began to toll the hour. Margaret startled. "I am wanted," she said. "There is a supper tonight, and I am late already, and if the housekeeper finds me gone, she will have my ears." She gathered her empty basin, then she hesitated, and drew from beneath her shawl a second small parcel. Hard-boiled eggs meant for her own dinner, and pressed them into his hand. "The church porch is dry," she told him. "The sexton leaves the side door on the latch. Do not let them find you on the green after dark. They will send for the constable." She was gone before he could answer, a gray figure hurrying up the lane toward the lit windows of Denholm Hall. Julian Hartford stood in the rain and watched her go, and turned the 2 eggs over in his raw hand. And for the first time in the long, bitter months since his return from the peninsula, he did not know what he felt. He had come home to bury a life. That was the truth. He carried and told no one. His elder brother Edmund, the man who ought to have held the title, had died of a fever, while Julian was still at war. And Julian had come back to a house full of people he did not trust, chief among them his late brother's widow, the Dowager Viscountess Cordelia Denholm, who had run the estate in his absence and did not mean to surrender an ounce of that running. He had ridden out 3 days past under the pretense of visiting a tenant farm. He had sent his horse and his manservant ahead by the main road, and then, on an impulse he could not fully explain, he had turned off onto the old drover's track in his plainest clothes and walked, because he wished to see only once how the world treated a man it believed to be nobody at all. The world had told him, and then a kitchen girl had told him something else entirely. He slept in the church porch that night, as she had said he might, wrapped in his ruined coat, and he did not sleep well, and in the gray before dawn, He made a decision that would have astonished his steward and enraged his sister-in-law. He would not reveal himself. Not yet. He would go up to the hall as what the village believed him to be, a laborer seeking winter work, and he would see the running of his own house from below the stairs, and he would find out whether the girl who had given away her supper to a stranger was a rare thing or a common one. He did not admit, even to himself, that he wished chiefly to see her again. Margaret rose that morning at 4:30, as she did every morning, and had the kitchen fire drawn and the great copper on to boil before the upper servants stirred. She was scrubbing the long deal table when the under-butler brought word that a man had come to the yard door asking for work, and that Mrs. Pruett, the housekeeper, had, against her better judgment and only because the woodpile wanted splitting before the frost, agreed to take him on a fortnight's trial at board and a shilling. Margaret looked up, and there he was in the doorway. The beggar from the green, washed and shaven now and wearing a borrowed smock, and her heart did a foolish thing in her chest that she did not have the leisure to examine. "You," she said. "Me," he agreed gravely. "You are to split the wood, so I am told." Mrs. Pruett, a lean and vigilant woman who missed very little, looked between them. "You are acquainted?" "He asked me the road last evening," Margaret said, which was near enough the truth. "I told him." The housekeeper sniffed and set the newcomer to work, and that was the beginning of it. His name, he said, was John Hart. It was not quite a lie. It was half his own name, laid down like a card face down on a table. The days that followed had a shape Margaret had not felt in a long time. John Hart split the wood and mended the broken hinge on the dairy door that had hung crooked for 2 years, and carried the heavy copper for her without being asked. And each evening, when the upper servants had gone up, he sat at the far end of the kitchen table while she finished the last of the pans, and they talked. He was, the other servants agreed, a peculiar sort of hired man. He did not gossip in the yard. He did not drink the small beer the grooms drank, and he did not swear. And when the boot-boy tried him with a coarse jest about the dairymaid, he only looked at the boy until the boy found somewhere else to be. He worked harder than the work required, and asked no thanks for it, Mrs. Mater. Pruett, who trusted no one on principle, admitted grudgingly that the woodpile had never been so high, nor the yard so orderly, and set him to a dozen small repairs that had waited years for a pair of willing hands. But it was in the kitchen after dark that Margaret came to know him. He asked her questions no one had asked her before: what her mother had been, whether she had chosen this work or fallen into it, what she would do, if she could do anything at all. He listened to the answers, which was rarer still, for Margaret had spent her life among people who asked questions only to wait their turn to speak. And this man asked, and then was silent, and let her fill the silence however she wished. "You ask a great many things," she told him one evening, scouring a pan that did not need it. "For a woodsman. A man on the road hears little," he said. "I have grown greedy for talk. And you are the only one in this house who speaks to me as though I were a person, and not a pair of hands." She glanced at him across the length of the table. The fire caught the scar through his eyebrow. "That is because you are a person," she said simply. "The hands are only what they pay for. I would keep a school," she told him one night, surprising herself. She had never said it aloud. "For the village children. There is no one to teach them their letters, and they grow up, as I nearly did, unable to read a word. My father could read. He taught me before he died. It is the only thing I own that no one can take." John Hart was quiet a moment. The fire settled. "And what keeps you from it?" She laughed, not unkindly at the size of the question. "A kitchen girl does not keep a school, Mr. Hart. A kitchen girl keeps a kitchen." She wrung out her cloth. "But I teach the scullery boy his letters of an evening, when Mrs. Pruett does not catch us. That is my school. It is 2 pupils and a chalk slate, and it will have to serve." He watched her hands as she worked, the raw knuckles, the burn scar along the side of one thumb from a spitting pan. There was something in his face she could not read, and being a sensible woman, she did not try. She had learned long ago not to build hopes out of the way men looked at her, for the looking led nowhere a girl in her position could afford to go. What Margaret did not know was that upstairs, in the great cold rooms above her head, a different sort of arithmetic was being done. The Dowager Viscountess Cordelia Denholm had ruled Denholm Hall for the better part of 4 years, and she did not intend to be ruled in turn by a brother-in-law who had spent those years abroad shooting Frenchmen while she held the estate together with her own 2 hands. Julian's absence from the hall these 3 days had not troubled her. Julian's absences never troubled her. What troubled her was the letter she had received from a cousin in town, a letter that spoke of the family's diminished funds and the pressing need for the new Viscount to marry, and marry well, and marry soon. She had a candidate ready. She had had her ready for a year. Miss Arabella Vane, a baronet's daughter of good fortune and better connections, cool and lovely and entirely suitable, who was even now a guest in the East Wing, waiting with a patience that was beginning to fray for a viscount who kept declining to appear. "He plays at farmers," Cordelia said to Miss Vane over their embroidery, her needle moving in short, precise stabs. "It is grief, I suppose, or some soldier's restlessness. It will pass. When he returns, you shall have him settled by Christmas, and I shall have this house on the footing it deserves." She set down her work and looked about the morning room, at the fine plaster ceiling her late husband's father had commissioned, at the tall windows giving onto the park. "You will find, my dear, when you are mistress here, that a great house is a living thing," she said. "It must be managed with a firm hand, or it will slip its collar. I have managed it 4 years, without thanks. My brother-in-law thinks a house runs itself while he shoots partridges and broods. It does not. It runs because I do not sleep, and it will go on running my way. Whatever soldier's whims he indulges, because I am the only one in it who understands what it costs to keep." Arabella Vane said nothing, and smiled the smile of a woman who has been told her whole life that she is the correct choice, and privately wondered when she might meet the man she was to spend her life beside. She had been 3 weeks in the East Wing. She had walked the gardens, and admired the pictures, and endured the dowager's instruction. And she had not once been consulted as to whether any of it was what she wanted. She was 23 and handsome and rich, and she had begun to feel, in that fine, cold house, remarkably like a piece of furniture that had been ordered and was waiting to be placed. She would meet him sooner than she expected, and not at all in the manner arranged. It happened on the 5th night. There was a supper for the neighboring gentry, and the kitchen was a roaring chaos of copper and steam, and one of the hired footmen dropped a whole dish of buttered pheasant on the flags, not 10 feet from where the dowager herself had come down, most unusually to inspect the sauces. Cordelia's temper, always near the surface, broke over the nearest head, and the nearest head was Margaret's clumsy, thieving creature, the dowager said, though Margaret had not touched the dish. And 2. This is what comes of taking girls from nowhere. No people, no breeding, no worth. You will pay for that pheasant out of your wages, and be grateful I do not turn you out into the road where I found you. The kitchen went silent. Margaret stood with her hands folded and her chin level, and did not weep, because weeping was a thing she had trained herself out of years ago. And she said, "Yes, my lady," in a voice that did not shake, and knelt to gather the ruined pheasant from the floor. At the scullery door, unseen by the dowager, John Hart stood with an armload of firewood and watched, and the wood in his arms did not move, and his knuckles had gone white around it, and his face had become something very still and very cold, like ice forming over the surface of a river. He did not step forward. He had not yet decided who he was in this house. But he did not forget it either. He carried it up to the cold porch of the church that night, where he still slept by choice, and he lay awake with the injustice of it turning slowly in his chest, and he understood for the first time exactly what his sister-in-law had made of the house his brother left. Margaret found him the next dawn splitting wood in the grey light, though there was wood enough split to last a month. "You need not have watched," she said quietly. Last night, you need not have watched that. No, he agreed. He set down the axe. I need not have. I'm sorry that I could do nothing. There was nothing to do. She is the dowager. I am the kitchen girl, that is the whole of it. She said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse than bitterness. You learn your place, or you learn the road. I learned my place. He looked at her for a long moment in the cold light. Miss Aldous, he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, and she felt it land somewhere beneath her ribs. I do not think a place is a thing a person is born to. I think it is a thing other people put on you, like a coat that does not fit, and tell you it is yours. Margaret stared at him. It was not the way a laborer spoke. She had noticed it before, the fine grain of his speech beneath the plain smock, the way he held himself when he forgot to stoop. She had told herself it was none of her concern. She told herself so again now. You are a strange sort of woodsman, Mr. Hart, she said. I have been a great many things, he answered, and a woodsman least convincingly of all. There was a silence between them then that was not empty. It was the kind of silence that stands in a doorway and will not leave. Margaret was aware of exactly where he stood, of the space of 3 feet of cold air between his hand and hers, of her own heart beating in her throat as though it meant to give her away. She stepped back. She had learned her place. And her place did not include the way the woodsman was looking at her, as though she were the first warm thing he had found in a very long winter. The fire wants tending, she said, and fled to her kitchen, and did not see him watch her go. The days grew colder and the strangeness between them grew warmer, and Julian Hartford found that the thing he had come to discover, he had discovered on the first evening on the green, and every day since had only confirmed it. She was not a rare thing pretending to be common. She was a rare thing the world had simply refused to see. He watched her feed a crippled beggar at the yard gate from her own portion. The man came Tuesdays, an old soldier missing a foot below the knee, and the upper servants shooed him off. And Margaret did not. She met him at the gate, with whatever she could spare from her own plate, and she asked after his health as though he were quality. And once Julian saw her sit 10 minutes on the cold mounting block listening to the man tell of a battle Julian himself had fought in, and she did not once let her face show that the telling wearied her. He watched her teach the scullery boy his letters by rushlight, patient past all reason, her finger tracing the shapes on the slate. The boy was slow and grew ashamed of it, and threw down the chalk one night and said he was too stupid to learn and always would be. And Margaret took his chin in her raw hand and told him that stupid was a word idle people used for a thing they had not troubled to teach, and that she had never yet met a child who could not learn if someone would only sit with him long enough, and that she would sit with him as long as it took, if it took a year, and the boy picked the chalk back up. He watched her stand between a drunken groom and the frightened dairymaid he was tormenting in the passage one evening, unarmed and unafraid, a slight woman in a gray gown facing down a man twice her weight, and send him off with 3 sentences so quiet and so exact that the man went red and then white and then away, and did not trouble the dairymaid again while Julian was in that house. None of it was done for an audience. That was the thing that undid him. She did not know he watched. She would have been astonished to learn that anyone thought her conduct worth the watching. She simply did the right thing in the dark corners of a great house where no one keeps account, and with each thing he saw, the plan that had been forming took firmer shape, and the wound he had carried home from the war grew quieter, and the cold thing in him that had frozen over his brother's grave began, against all his intention, to thaw. He had not meant to love anyone. He had come home to bury a life. He had believed himself finished with the business of the heart, had believed the war had burned it out of him, along with so much else. He was wrong, and he knew he was wrong the night he heard her singing to herself over the wash, some old country air her mother must have taught her, and felt his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with grief. The wound he carried was this: in Spain 3 years past, he had commanded a company, and he had trusted the wrong man, a fellow officer named Ferris who had sworn a road was clear when it was not. Ferris was the son of an earl. He had a way of speaking that made a listener feel foolish for doubting him. And Julian, younger then and greener, had not doubted him. He had led his men down that road on Ferris's word, and the word had been a lie. Told, not from malice, but from idleness, because Ferris had not wished to ride out and see the road for himself, and had judged that the risk was small and the effort large. 11 men had not come back. Julian had carried 2 of them himself, and one had died in his arms in the shade of an olive tree, a farrier's son from Kent, who could not read and had asked Julian once to write a letter home to his mother for him, which Julian had done, and which the mother could not read either, and which had been read to her by the parish clerk after the boy was already 3 weeks in Spanish ground. Julian had learned in a single afternoon of blood that the marks of the world meant nothing at all, that a fine coat and a fine name could sit upon a coward and a liar as easily as upon an honest man, and that he had been a fool to weigh a person by his surface. He had come home unable to trust the surface of anything. He had looked at his own class and seen Ferris in all their faces. And here, in his own kitchen, was a girl who had no surface worth trusting by the world's account, who wore a thin gray gown and answered to no name but her station, and who was the truest person he had met in 5 years. The world had it exactly backwards, and only he could see it, and the seeing was equal parts joy and grief. He carried that knowledge like a coal in his hand. It could not last, of course. The world Julian had stepped out of came looking for him, as it always would. His manservant, Thomas, who had waited 3 days at the tenant farm with the horses, and grown frantic, at last rode up to the hall to raise the alarm that the Viscount was missing, only to be met in the stable-yard by the sight of his master splitting wood in a servant's smock. Thomas's face performed a slow astonishment. "My lord," he said, too loudly before Julian could silence him. "My lord, thank God, we feared you drowned in a ditch, and the stable-yard, which held at that hour 2 grooms, a boot-boy, and Mrs. Pruett, come out to scold, went entirely still. The word went up through the house like fire through dry thatch. The woodsman was the Viscount. John Hart was Julian Hartford. The beggar the village had turned from its doors was the master of Denholm Hall. It reached the kitchen, last of all, brought by the breathless scullery boy, and Margaret set down the pan she was holding very carefully so that it would not clatter, so that no one would see her hands. She thought of every evening at the long table. She thought of the questions he had asked her, the school she had confessed to wanting, the things she had said believing herself safe in the company of a man as low as herself. She thought of the space of 3 feet of cold air in the dawn, and how she had stepped back, and thanked God, now that she had. He had watched her. He had watched her the way one watches a curiosity, a lord playing at poverty, amusing himself below the stairs, and she had fed him her own supper, and told him her whole heart, and he had let her. And every word of it had been a lie face down on the table. When he came to find her, an hour later, dressed now in his own dark coat, with his own name on him like a crown, she was in the still room with her back very straight. "Margaret," he said. "You will address me as Miss Aldous, my lord," she said, not turning. She was grinding something in a mortar with more force than the task required. "As is proper. As it always should have been, Margaret. Please, let me explain." "Explain what, my lord?" The pestle stopped. "That you sat at my table these 3 weeks and let me talk. That I told you of my father, and my mother's song, and the school I will never have, believing I spoke to a man as poor as myself, a man who could not use a word of it against me, because he had nothing and was nothing. That is what I believed, that I was safe. A kitchen girl is never safe with a gentleman, my lord. Every girl in service learns that in her first month. I forgot it. I forgot it because you split wood and mended a hinge and asked me questions with a kind face, and I let myself forget the one thing I could not afford to forget." She set the pestle down very precisely. "So, what is there to explain? You have explained it perfectly by standing there in that coat. There is nothing to explain. She turned then and her face was calm, and only her eyes betrayed her. You are the Viscount. I am the kitchen girl. You told me yourself, a place is a coat other people put on us. But you were never wearing the coat, my lord. You were only trying mine on for a fortnight, to see how it felt. And now you have taken it off. Her voice did not rise. That was the worst of it, for both of them. I hope it was instructive. It was not amusement, he said, and there was something raw in it. Margaret, I swear to you, it was never that. I have pheasant to pay for, she said. Out of my wages? Excuse me, my lord. And she went past him and out of the still room. And he let her go, because he did not yet know how to say the thing that was true in a way she could believe. And because he had learned, in Spain, that trust, once a man has broken it, cannot be mended with words alone. That would have been the end of it, perhaps, had the Dowager Viscountess not chosen that same week to force the matter she had been arranging all along. Cordelia had received her wayward brother-in-law's return with cold triumph, and had wasted no time. Miss Arabella Vane was produced. A dinner was arranged, grand and public, the neighboring gentry summoned, the announcement of an understanding between the Viscount and the baronet's daughter, all but written on the place cards. Cordelia had decided the matter, and Cordelia did not lose. The house that had slipped from her control these past weeks would be restored to its proper order, and the strange business of the master among the servants would be papered over with a wedding. Below the stairs, Margaret worked the dinner as she worked, every dinner invisible in the corner, carrying and clearing, and she watched from the shadow of the serving screen as the Viscount sat at the head of his own table with Arabella Vane at his right hand, and she told herself that the pain in her chest was only the heat of the room. The Dowager rose to speak between the courses. She had the whole company's attention, the candlelight gleaming on the diamonds at her throat, and she was at the summit of her confidence, and she made the error that people at the summit of their confidence so often make. She reached for one cruelty too many. Before we go on, she said, smiling, I must say a word on the peculiar events of these past weeks, of which some of you will have heard whispers. My brother-in-law, in his soldier's eccentricity, saw fit to pass some days incognito among the lower servants, a harmless game. Her eyes found Margaret at the screen, and her smile sharpened. Though I fear it has given certain persons above their station a most unfortunate idea of their own importance. The kitchen girl, I am told, quite fancied she had made a friend of a viscount. A ripple of laughter moved along the table. One does what one can to correct such delusions. She will be dismissed in the morning. Of course we cannot have the china counted by a girl with ideas. The laughter thickened. Arabella Vane did not laugh. Margaret stood at the screen with the whole weight of the room's amusement upon her, and she did not run, and she did not weep, and she gathered an empty dish from the sideboard, because her hands needed something to do. Julian Hartford set down his glass. The small sound of it against the cloth cut through the laughter. He rose to his feet at the head of his table, and the room quieted. Expecting a jest, expecting him to laugh along and put the awkwardness to bed, he crossed the length of the room instead. Past the diamonds, past the astonished gentry, past Arabella Vane, who watched him go with something like relief on her face, to the serving screen where a kitchen girl stood with an empty dish in her raw hands. He stopped before her. The whole room saw him stop. This is the woman I intend to marry, he said. 7 words. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain or justify or heap scorn on his sister-in-law, or make a speech. He said the 7 words and let them stand in the silence, and the silence held them, and every soul at that table understood that the master of Denholm Hall had just placed his whole name and rank on the scale against the whole weight of his world, and had found the kitchen girl heavier. Cordelia's face had gone white. "Julian," she said, and her voice, for the first time in 4 years, was not steady. "You cannot. You do not know what you are doing. She is nobody. She has no people, no fortune, no name." "She has a name," he said without turning from Margaret. "It is Margaret Aldous. She fed a stranger her own supper on a cold night when this whole village turned its back on him. She asked him nothing, and expected nothing, and gave what she had. Now he looked at his sister-in-law, and his eyes were the gray of slate under water, and they were not cruel, but they were final. I have dined at the tables of people with every name and every fortune, and I have watched them lie to save themselves an errand and let better men die for it. I will weigh a person by what they do in the dark when no one is watching. By that measure, Cordelia, this house has been kept by the wrong woman for a long while. He did not say more than that. He did not need to. The dowager sat down slowly, and the diamonds at her throat rose and fell too quickly, and around the table the neighboring gentry began one by one to understand which way the world had just turned, and to arrange their faces accordingly. Arabella Vane rose from her place. She came. To everyone's surprise, not to protest, but to stand a moment before Margaret, and she looked at her with frank and curious eyes. "I was told I was the correct choice," she said, low, for Margaret alone. "I never once was asked whether I wished to be. I find I am glad to be wrong." She inclined her head, a small, precise courtesy, one woman to another, and returned to her seat. And that was the last cruelty the evening held, and it was not a cruelty at all. Julian turned back to Margaret. The room fell away from them both. "I lied to you about my name," he said quietly. "Now for her and not for the company. I will not lie to you about anything again as long as I live. I did not watch you for amusement, Margaret. I watched you because in 5 years you were the first true thing I had found, and I did not know how to tell you so without frightening it away." He held out his hand. It was not a command. For all his rank, in that moment, it was a question. "I do not ask you to answer me tonight, or before all these people. I ask only that you do not go out into the road in the morning. Stay. Let me court you properly as you deserve, and if at the end of it you will still have nothing of me, I will put you in a cottage, with your school, and never trouble you again." "But do not go." Margaret looked at the hand. She looked at the raw knuckles that matched her own, for he had truly split that wood, whatever else was false. And she thought of the man on the green with ash-colored lips who had said, "You did not ask where I have come from." And she understood that whatever coat he wore, that man had been real, and had been speaking to her the whole time. "You split a great deal more wood than the trial required, my lord," she said, and her voice was not quite steady now. "I know it." Mrs. Pruitt remarked upon it. "I could not think of another reason to remain in the kitchen of an evening." And Margaret Aldous, kitchen girl of Denholm Hall, put her raw hand into the hand of the Viscount Denholm, in front of the whole astonished county, and did not let it go. The winter that followed was the coldest in 20 years, and the warmest Margaret had ever known. He courted her as he had promised, properly and without haste. And the county, which had been prepared to be scandalized, discovered instead that it was charmed, for there is nothing the gentry love so well as a story they can tell. And this was a very good story. The Dowager Viscountess retired, with a settlement more generous than her conduct had earned, to a handsome house in Bath, where she told the tale rather differently and was believed by no one who had been present. She was not destroyed. She was corrected and displaced, and in time she wrote a stiff letter of civil congratulation that Julian answered with more warmth than it deserved, because he had buried enough bitterness in Spain and did not wish to keep any in his own house. They were married in the spring, in the village church, in the same porch where Julian had once slept on a stone bench, wrapped in a ruined coat. Margaret would not be married anywhere else. The whole of Nettlefold came. The blacksmith's wife who had drawn her children indoors, and the innkeeper who had folded his arms, all of them, and Margaret received them without a flicker of triumph, for she had learned her worth a long way from their opinion of it. The school opened that same year in a stone building at the edge of the green, with real slates and real books, and a fire that never wanted for wood, for the master of the hall saw to the woodpile himself, and would let no one else touch it, which the villagers thought an eccentricity, and Margaret understood as a promise. She taught there 3 mornings a week, the Viscountess Denholm with chalk dust on her fine sleeves. and the village children learned their letters, and grew up able to read a word, every one of them. On an evening late in that first married autumn, a year almost to the day since a beggar had limped into Nettlefold, Julian found his wife in the kitchen of their own great house, though she had 100 rooms now and need never enter it. She was sitting at the long deal table with the scullery boy, who was a scullery boy no longer but a pupil at her school, and a favorite of the household besides, and she was tracing letters on a chalked slate by the light of a single candle, patient, past all reason, exactly as she had been the first night he watched her and understood he was lost. He stood in the doorway a while and did not speak, unwilling to break it. She looked up and found him there. She did not rise. She was the Viscountess of Denholm Hall, and she saw no reason to rise from her own kitchen table for her own husband, and he loved her the more for it. "You are watching me again," she said. "I am," he admitted. "I find I never quite stopped." She smiled and set down the chalk, and the candle burned steady between them. And outside the first snow of the winter began to fall on the green where he had once stood cold and unwanted, and been given bread by the only person in the world who had looked at him and simply seen a man. "Come and sit then," said Margaret. "The fire is warm, and you are not." And he came, and he sat, and he was. If Margaret's stories stayed with you, stay a moment longer and let her know. Leave a word below, and I will read it. Thank you for staying until the end.